So today we're going to talk about a new term, which is a civilization. And in particular, we're going to look at what we might consider the first civilization, which was Sumer. Now, we we've already looked at agriculture and how agriculture evolved in certain human societies around 10,000 BC. But what we're going to look at today is the rise of the first civilizations, which are kind of like a bigger thing than just a town or even a city. So we're going to define them as it's a complex interaction between human community, non-living human things, and a geographic environment to form a common goal. So the idea is it's peoples, animals, plants, and the geography working together to accomplish something. It doesn't have to be anything like super admirable or moral. It's generally just to accomplish living together harmoniously. Um, this kind of emerges from agriculture. So at first, humans are nomadic. They walk around foraging. Once they start to settle down and they form farming settlements, towns, villages, cities, eventually civilizations will emerge from this. So cities aren't really a civilization necessarily. A civilization is more than that. It has to have something that like unites the people within this civilization. Um, and cities are going to be an important step towards civilization. For instance, civilizations need that surplus of crops in order to actually exist. But let's uh, let's actually take a look at what a civilization should have. So, domestication and permanent settlements, that's basically just agriculture. Government, sometimes agricultural societies had government, but more importantly, things like specialization of labor and social stratification are essential for a civilization. That basically means people having different kinds of jobs and there being different kinds of hierarchies within a civilization, or not even necessarily hierarchies, but some people who are very important to society. So, in addition to having just what you would need to survive in one place, like farming communities, you also have like a greater degree of complexity, which is something that your book, This Fleeting World, talks a lot about. Um, Other parts of civilization that are generally considered defining characteristics are written records, advanced technology, and waste removal, being able to like actually get rid of the waste you produce. So, what we might consider the first civilizations are things you've already learned about. They're like the Yellow River civilization in China, the Indus Valley civilization in India, the Nile civilization in Egypt, and today we're going to look at the Sumerians in ancient Mesopotamia. Um, so Mesopotamia basically just means the land between two rivers. That's the translation of it. And as we already know, this area became really, really warm and fertile after the end of the last ice age. It was perfect for agriculture. We also learned that this region, the Fertile Crescent, had a wealth and abundance of really good crops for agriculture, and that's what made it so good. It had wheat and barley and all these different domesticated animals like cows and goats and sheep. This region is fed by these two rivers, which come from the runoff of the Zagros Mountains in the Fertile Crescent. So it's basically this really really fertile landscape fed by two different rivers. And in this region, civilization develops slowly. So we've already learned that about 10,000 years ago, um, this region was able to start developing actual like permanent settlements that had agriculture. About 6,000 years ago, these really became the first cities. And about 3,500 years ago, there was enough interaction between these different cities that they had a common civilization known as Sumer. I mean, you can almost think of it as like an early country, except for the country doesn't have defined borders necessarily, and it doesn't. It's not really as solid of a feature. Like the United States has very clear borders. Sumer wouldn't necessarily have this. It's just kind of like a common interaction and common goal between cities. So, for instance, Sumer had all these little red dots are individual cities within them, and there was enough trade networks, and the military defended all these cities that Sumer was considered one civilization. Okay. Um, just to reinforce this, you can take a look at the top timeline, and it tells you when some of the first cities evolved in Sumer, but then the bottom timeline has a different time for the emergence of a civilization in Mesopotamia. So the first cities emerging in Sumer happened a little bit earlier than the first civilizations. Okay. So once again, a civilization isn't just staying in one place, it's having some kind of common goal that unites the people and cities within a civilization. But what we don't really know is how a few things actually evolved and why they evolved. So that includes government, social stratification, and specialization of labor. And we're going to look at Sumer as like a case study because it's the first civilization, really. So three things that are going to help develop this social stratification in government and divisional labor are military, religion, and trade. So that's what we're going to look at today. So military, actually near the Fertile Crescent and really near all these river civilizations, there's something called the Eurasian steppe, which is not very good for agriculture. It's pretty high up. It's really arid, so there aren't a lot of rivers. There's a lot of mountains surrounding it. It can get really, really cold in the winter. So you'll see on the bottom map, the green area is what you consider the Eurasian steppe. Today, that's where countries like Afghanistan, countries like Mongolia are, and it's really difficult to have agriculture, at least, 5,000 years ago. The top map has, in the green areas, that's where the river civilizations are. So you can see they're all like slightly south of the steppe. Now, in the steppe, they learned how to hunt and fight as kind of their way of life. They were always on the move. They had domestic animals, so they did have domestic animals like horses and sometimes sheep and sometimes camels. So they were able to like herd these animals and get milk from them and hide from them, but they didn't stay in one place like agriculturalists. For the farming communities, the steppe was kind of like the frontier. And the steppe people would often raid cities and try and take the surplus crops that they had. And so cities had to basically pay soldiers to defend them. And so what they would do is they would pay tribute, which we'll talk more about. But this is kind of like it's a form of taxation. So farming communities would raise money from their citizens. They would pay soldiers this money so that they could defend them from these raiders from the steppe, these pastoral nomad raiders. So in a way, these very first military leaders who defended the surplus crops and farms were the first soldiers that were actually paid, like the first professional soldiers. And their job was to keep these pastoral nomads from the Eurasian steppe from raiding and taking all their food. Now, religion is another thing that's going to emerge within agricultural communities as something really important. The first anything we could consider religion was something called animism. It was basically this idea that like spirits inhabit all things. And there are people named shamans who could potentially communicate with these living spirits. Shamans are kind of the earliest like foraging Paleolithic human religions. But with agriculture, these shamans started to communicate with, or say they're communicating with gods of elements like sun and water. And this was because people wanted to figure out how to get sun and water and earth and use them to grow crops. So instead of like worrying about the living things within the animals that these foragers would eat, they started worrying about how to please the god of water so that they could get the right amount of water for their agriculture. So these gods in Sumer evolved in something called deities. They're basically like gods with personalities. And depending on what happened throughout Sumerian history, these different gods developed different personalities. So you could imagine if there was a drought for a while, the water god might be considered like angry, right, or stubborn. And so over time, these different gods evolved into these different deities with personalities. A lot of historians actually think that the Sumerian religion spread out to other regions like India and maybe even Greece and Rome. And so this idea of like gods with really distinct personalities actually might have evolved in Sumer. And not because Sumer was anything special, it's kind of just a logical development of religion, right? If you worship a god of water and you don't get water, you might think the god of water is angry or mad or jealous or something. Um, so these priests in Sumerian culture and really throughout a lot of these early civilizations were really, really respected because it was thought that they had deep knowledge of how to make crops better. And so they were paid, and we'll get into that in just a sec. The last step of this is trade. So because Sumer had a surplus of crops, things like sheep and wheat and barley, um, they were able to trade more. The first pack animals actually evolved in Egypt, but Sumer eventually got access to these pack animals, and they were donkeys. And so you could actually haul these different things on donkeys. You could also use the river. So the different methods they would trade were either through rivers like the Tigris and Euphrates, or they would use caravans of donkeys. So how does it all connect? We talked about military, religion, and trade. Well, basically, the wealthiest agriculturalists, those who had the best placement of land near crops, or excuse me, the best crops, like near rivers, certain people just did better than others, and those who did better slowly accumulated more wealth. So eventually, you have the first like wealthy and poor people, and these wealthy people had lots of power. They could afford to pay for the military. They could afford to actually trade with some of their surplus stuff and get more money. They could afford to pay people to think up new tools, and they could afford to actually pay priests. And as we'll see, priests play a really important role in Sumerian religion and Sumerian civilization. Um, these wealthy people could also pass on their wealth to their sons and daughters, and so these become the first like kings and queens. So these wealthy agriculturalists eventually become the first leaders. They seem to be wise because their crops do well. They can protect people because they can give money to the military. So these kind of become the first leaders of civilization. Just for some reference, the city of Sumer, or a typical Sumerian city, generally had wealthy farmers were near the rivers, right? And over time, they slowly consolidated the wealth so that they actually controlled all the farms. The harbor, which was down by the river, this is where like the craftsmen and the merchants and some of the soldiers actually stayed. The divine households, these were like where the priests lived. These were generally near the center of town, and they were paid for by these wealthy farmers. So the religion's the religion's leaders and the wealthy farmers kind of worked together, and the workers lived out in these little huts, like kind of on the outskirts of town. The Sumerian city itself really revolves around religion. Sumer actually has these ziggurats, which are this black and white photo to the right. They're kind of like pyramids, and these were financed from workers, and it's really like good evidence of how much people respected religion in Sumer. Sumerian priests helped feed the workers. They, in times of like drought or struggle, they were kind of the people that Sumerians looked to for guidance. They also helped finance like some of the first artists and writers, as we'll see. Sumer also was able to expand, and really this is because the militaries that were constantly fed crops did a lot better than some of the Eurasian pastoral nomads who had to kind of find their food, and when their domesticated animals weren't doing so well, they didn't have food. They were constantly on the move. So you also had agricultural societies like Sumer just could have more soldiers because they had more food. Um, so typically, at least early on, civilizations like Sumer did a lot better than places like pastoral nomads in the Eurasian steppe. And so pastoral nomads, they would keep raiding, but then they had this option: should we keep raiding, or should we just settle down and get regular meals and just live in Sumer? And a lot of them chose to actually live in Sumer, and so this only expanded the Sumerian civilization. We also had advanced technology and writing as part of civilization. And really, the best example of advanced technology was irrigation systems. So, those rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, they would flood in the early spring and summer when the snow melted in the mountains. So, when they flooded, canals were dug to actually like capture the water. And then this actually irrigated the Sumerian crops. So, originally, you would have a river that doesn't actually reach the crops, but then when the river floods, you would trap pieces of the river to either side, and then you could grow your crops in the space in between. So this was what we might consider advanced technology. You also had things like stone tools and boats and plows that were made by people working with stone tools who were fed crops, surplus crops. Sumerians also developed, as far as we know, the first writing system. It was called cuneiform, or evolved eventually into cuneiform, and basically it was made to keep track of trade deals. So it wasn't like they just sat down and thought, let's make a writing system. It was merchants who came up with this, and it's because they needed like some way to actually keep track of all their trade deals. So it was an accounting tool, basically. And then as Sumerians kind of grew, and their wealth increased, and they did more trade, and their religion diffused. This writing system moved towards Egypt, and Egypt turned it into hieroglyphics. It eventually would influence the Phoenicians, who created the first alphabet, which in turn spread to places like Greece and Rome. So, once again, the only thing we haven't discussed is waste removal. Basically, the Sumerians were able to do composting, but what we'll see is that over time, their waste removal wasn't as efficient as they thought. And this would actually lead to their collapse, which we'll talk about later. But just for a quick review, Sumerians' legacy includes it was really the first intensive agricultural civilization, so people lived there year round, and there was different jobs and people interacted within the civilization. Sumerians also did contributed lots of inventions and innovations to human communities, including the wheel, the chariot. They, as far as we know, invented things like arithmetic and geometry, astronomy, and most notably, they invented the first writing system. They also had military technology that diffused to different cities through pastoral nomads. So some of those same enemies they fought would steal those technologies and take them to other civilizations. And also the Sumerian religion is something that we can start to recognize seeds of. For instance, the early religion had 7 gods, which became the names of the 7 days of the week. And this is why we might consider that we have 7 days of the week, because the Sumerians had 7 gods early on. So, this was just kind of an overview of the first civilization, so we have an idea of how things like power evolves in civilizations. So where did government come from? Where did organized religion come from? These kinds of things. Okay?